This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
Dave
and
on the board.
Today is the 10th of May, and Dave on the board.
Dave on the board, that's right. Right.
That's it. Okay.
Lots to talk about.
So, yeah, we had a new mayor installed this week. A lot of people there. I think she'll be a very good mayor. And she's very interested in C2B, which is the fiber optic system. And that relates to some of the things we are doing, because if you're going to invite people to come to Silicon Valley, you're going to have second level manufacturing and industries around, and we may need the little piece of railroad line that we've been talking about that's being closed out and abandoned between Bonneville and Seymour. So there were other people installed too, and it was a very busy night. Spring came late, and growth has been absolutely fantastic. Really quickly, if we didn't get to burn as much as we would like, so the plants are growing through the litter that was from last season. Not too bad. They're doing all right. Some plants are much more aggressive than others, so they come through, and some are earlier than others. One that's out at the moment is starry-eyed grass. I was photographing yesterday. It was a kind of dull day, so I didn't get the starry-eyed grass open and showing, but it was there. And the hyacinths is up, and we have to thank Ron Sleater for that. He knows where hyacinths are, and he's given us seed, and over the years it's taken off, especially at Lake Park. Partially because of the hyacinths, I went around Lake Park. It was wet and sort of raining. You've got to watch out when you have electronic equipment. Water and electronic equipment doesn't go well together, but it was light rain. And I put on my wellies. Once again, Ron Sleater has been at that, because they prevent the ticks from getting into you as well as keeping your feet warm. And I have to think about what I was doing. I was photographing the early spring expression of plants that are not yet flowering. So that gets to be a little long-winded. I'm thinking that really we need to have a blog for this, because when we talk to you, we can't possibly explain what rosinweed looks like when it's coming up, or the grasses are growing through the litter. It's very hard to visualize that. So, in fairness, I think we ought to do a blog of some of this sort of thing. Sometimes it's very helpful to have a long shot, medium shot, close up, and that one takes a lot of speak if you're going to speak it through on the radio. So I think we do have some other visual concerns. And I took quite a few photographs. Sometimes it's very helpful to take photographs on a dull day, because you don't get the strong shadows, and it lets you see. Lots of different lightings have their different advantages, but certainly on a dull day you can get a low contrast, but you can often focus in on what you're wanting to talk about. Some of the plants have not come yet. The lead plant, for instance, you think, oh, the plant has died eventually. And then, wow, here it is with its buds on it. Culver's root is out. The penstemons, the beard's tongue, is out. Not in flower, certainly. And for the neophyte, that sort of plant is hard to recognize. But I walked around for quite a while. Some plants express themselves even with their old clones. For instance, I can pick up purple clover very easily because it sort of remains in a clump. Other plants have leftover stems. The bee balm, a balm for bees, which is largely pollinated with bumblebees. The last season's flowering parts often remain. We even made a silkscreen of the monarda in bloom, or in the snow rather. So yes, also weeds, and the weeds include trees, and they include reed canary grass, which gets into the drains, and honeysuckle. I see a honeysuckle, and then there is the proverbial sweet clover. So the weeds can sometimes adapt more quickly to climate changes, and although you may not think that there are climate changes, our plants are getting used to a warmer climate and a more sporadic climate. So yesterday and today even you were getting rain in pieces that may not have come in the tradition. The tradition is rain in the spring. Yes, we get rain in the spring and we get rain in the fall. But things are changing, and if you're watching the climate, you'll need to adapt. So some of the invasive plants, including some aggressive prairie plants, will grow very fast and adapt to that climate change, so they can kind of take over. So we have to watch what's going on. Came up 45, where the power grid has been put in, and there's 6 or 8 construction easements there, where they planted a prairie-like mix, which we never got to know was, and the prairie plants that were lopped off with mowing and covered with industrial pallets so that heavy equipment could go in there and not destroy them, they are growing, and I'm very, very pleased to the extent of perhaps calling up Ameren and saying thank you for working with us and putting down pallets so that the prairie wouldn't be destroyed. The forested part near to Windsor Road is growing apace, so we had the help of huge mowers to mow that down, but it's coming back with weed trees that we really don't approve of. It's just a very disturbed area. The Grand Prairie Friends had a plant sale, and I think a very successful one. There are lots of people helping out, and I think that contributes to their spreading the word about prairie, and also gives them some income. I went over there with a bunch of books because a bunch of cardboard boxes. I get them locally, and I usually take them to Books for Prisoners. But sometimes the Books for Prisoners get more boxes than they need, so I thought that they might be able to use that at the Grand Prairie Friends. But by that time, the main drive had gone through, and I think they're very pleased. I went to the sale outside, the farmers market, and I always enjoy that. I talk to people, and so I buy some asparagus, and not a lot, but enough to keep going. And talking to people is friendly to do, and it lets you talk some of your problems out. And we have a few, including an abandonment and land invasion. The land invasion, as of Sunday night last week, we didn't have the quarter mile by 100 feet dug up by the adjacent farmer. I'm not sure. I haven't been over during the week. We've been doing a lot to try and save the soul of 3.2 miles of old ICG, Illinois Central and Gulf Railroad, from Seymour to Bonneville, because it's not producing enough grain to make it profitable for Canadian National. So the rent went up, and then the grain went on the road, and that's fairly expensive in terms of environmental use of the roads and use of gasoline. So we're hoping that we can work with Canadian National to keep that bed afloat and to make sure that if the possibility arises, we can bring historic railroad into Champaign-Urbana. That might be a dream that's long distance, but if you don't get these corridors while they're being abandoned, you don't have them forever. We're so glad that we started out to do the interim trail use agreement with the rail trail, which is now going in between Urbana and Kickapoo State Park. So that rail bed will be preserved under the Rail Banking Act, and that's very helpful. So we would like the same Rail Banking Act to perhaps retain the bed between Bonneville and Seymour. Bonneville is very anxious to see that they get enough back line to be able to store 100 cars, because that's what makes grain shipment financial, is to have 50 or 100 grain cars to go out at once. That's a lot of grain. Each of those cars used to be 100 tons. Now they're going to be 112 tons. So that's a lot of grain to get out of an elevator. But GMOs are yielding higher. We may not necessarily agree with GMOs all the time, because they're doing things with genetics that speeds things up so much that you don't really know what's going to happen in 25 years' time. So there's some disenchantment with GMOs, but the fact is that GMOs are yielding way better than the regular, also genetically improved crops. So there's been a wave over the years of improvements. One is fertilizer, herbicides, genetics, and so on. So you can look at a graph of corn yields over the years and see the graph has gone up, sometimes to the point where we have too much corn. So then you get ethanol and things like that. And ethanol is not necessarily the most efficient way of using corn. There are other things. One of them is bacterial generation, or brewing of probably carbohydrates that you can change into something that almost looks like benzene, and can be more compatible with the gas that you put into your car. Ethanol doesn't necessarily do it. Okay, so we're looking at the possibility of closing out that line. We're not sure that Canadian National wants to have us have a rail trail. I think they're in a mood to decapitate short lines that used to be main lines but have been left to serve as elevators. Because on the east coast to the west coast, we seem to have been able to do things with the short lines because there's more population in those areas. In the Midwest, there's a long distance between short lines, and that's costly to deal with. So perhaps no rail trail, perhaps no railroad line, perhaps we go back to farming and a few more rows of corn and soybeans. So we have to try and convince Canadian National that there are good reasons for keeping that line afloat. And one of them is that you have a huge $25 million fiber optic system around town that will attract theoretical people with 1 foot in the university and 1 foot on South First Street, or even further. But those industries will spawn other industries, like roboting or a whole bunch of things that we need short lines for. And this little 3 miles may be very useful. So can we debate with Canadian National? Not easy, because there's been lots of debates lately, and they include fracking, and they include the shipment of coal, which people don't want that carbon footprint. And so there are lots of debates, and sometimes people who have control are not very sympathetic to all of those of us who are wee folk, little folk, who have other issues. So, okay. We did do a very we got a couple of very cooperative people who aren't quite sure, but we instituted a Rails, Trails and Greenways organization, which may be helpful in us acquiring these sorts of beds. We're talking about rails as well as trails, not rail trails, but rails as well as trails. And there's a need for that sort of institution in East Central Illinois. We long ago did put together the Grand Prairie Friends to concentrate on prairie, and that has happened. And they morphed over a little into forest, but they've done very well with forest, and they're asking for help to buy 90 acres now, which will increase their area in the Charleston area quite a bit. But every once in a while, you need a specific organization which will care for something that's not being cared for. Yeah, if you're a general environmentalist, you will try to bring these groups together. And that's been tried about 10 times here, to get all the conservation groups together to, and it's okay if you have a real issue like PVCs in the landfill, plastic in the landfill and leaching, then you might get together those people for a period. But it shortly, once you win a point, and we did win a point last week, the company that was going to put PVCs into the landfill has retreated, and so that's no longer an issue. And shortly, the regional planning that went with that will disappear, because people aren't awfully happy about having their private farms or private waterways or private aquifers controlled by other than themselves. And so there's an individualism here that is kind of anti-zoning, anti-regional planning, but it's very, very essential. And if you're going to deal with railroads, roads, airlines, you need to be on some wavelength that at a state level or a regional level, or if you're dealing with drains, you're at the place where you have drainage commissioners, and that's like 400 drainage commissioners in the state, and each of those commissions would have 3 people, and that's sort of regional planning in a way, but that's because drainage is God, where you have soils that were covered with swamp and water, and if you don't have that regional planning, then you will not have agriculture. So we would like to encourage the regional planning and think of rails, trails, and greenways, and how they interact and how they can use the same territory if necessary. The rail trail movement has just produced a book which deals with rails with trails. But we're not awfully excited about that because that takes out a swath of our own remaining prairie. And I had to explain to people, I had visitors come and they were looking in my front door, and people look in my front door and wonder what the hell goes on in there. And so I gave them a little field trip. It was a pocket prairie, and you have to explain that there's no prairie left. It's along the railroad beds. And so rails with trails is a little awkward. We have to deal with deadlines. That's part of our problem. And you don't always know what deadline is for which. There's a different deadline for a rail carrier than there is for a rail trail movement. And some of it seems a little vague. So you have to find your friends and relatives in the various surface transportations or Canadian nationals to try and figure out what is the deadline. Does this line get torn out on the 12th, which is very near? We're in the 10th now. Sometimes abandonments are done very quickly so that you can't change your mind. It's done. And so we're aware of that. And I thank the people for doing a quick rails, trails, and greenways in case we need that organization. What a stress here that we're not necessarily looking for money. At this point, we're looking for ideas. Worthwhile ideas will almost always generate money if they're really worthwhile ideas. Not always, but there's a chance that if you have a good idea, then you can go looking for support money. We wonder about the railroads. There's a very good traditional railroad civil engineering department here, and they have always looked after theoretical research associated with the railroads. They had a railroad spin lab there, which would take a railroad wheel and spin it till it broke up. So you would find out what the weaknesses were and where. And that is continuing. But when you have theoretical discussions and discoveries, there's always the people who have to take a wrench and undo a piece of stick rail. There's the people who have to pull the pins, take out the plates, replace the rail. And so that's usually regarded as applied. There's surveying, there's signaling, there's a lot of applied things. So when you're thinking of this 3 miles, you might also think, how does this fit into an overall picture? Could you go to Parkland College and ask if they're taking over Willard Airport from the university because there's an applied interest there? Could the rails be also applied, and could we have the opportunity for young folk especially to train themselves to work with rails and to work with the technology that goes with them. For instance, if you're going to install a new railroad, we get a little disappointed because Wi-Fi, which is the technology that allows them to talk to each other from a distance, doesn't go through trees. So there's a temptation to take the tree down and clear the site so you can work it. So just little things like that you might want to say, excuse us, but that tree might be worth $1,000. And we want you to think as an engineer about the biology that you're working with. So somebody needs to approach the university, which in the original had a lot to do with the establishment of the community colleges. And so you can work with a theoretical group. Then you might even have someone with an interest in this to work with the university to establish a secondary level of education. That means the person that's working at the theoretical base might be wanting to do a PhD, which is not necessarily pure research. It's applied research, but it's putting in the theory of how do you put together this group of secondary level people. Could it relate to a interurban between Muhammad, Parkland College, and St. Joe and Danville? How do you look at planning? And what would be allowable and doable at a community college? Community college population has gone down a little bit. There's not the free-floating money to do it. A lot of courses and things there. So there surely would be some debate if we did that sort of thing. But in the long run, it may be that we can find someone who could do a master's degree or a doctorate that would spread a little into planning and a little into education and a little into engineering. So you look for someone who has that sort of skill, the ability to have a railroad engineering degree and be able to perhaps drive a train or know the regulations that go with railroading. So that is an example of how you would create an idea and then you tie onto it. And then if you have a specific thing, then you might go to Kickstart or something like that and ask for money. But first is the idea, and that's what we're working with Canadian National, and we hope that it will work. Now,
This would be a really good time to pause because it's half past to mention to folks who are just tuning in that you're listening to the Prairie Monk here on WEFT Champaign 90.1 FM. We are community radio for East Central Illinois. Today is May the 10th, 2015, and the discussion has been the usual of conservation and the environment around East Central Illinois. And from looking at the notes Dave gave me, it looks like you're going to be talking about something a little bit different coming up pretty soon.
yeah. Well, let me add just one thing about railroading. The Black Dog Saloon will be opening soon. That's the old railroad station. I have to explain to people that we have 3 railroad stations in Champlain, or depots, or whatever you want to call them. The more modern one is MTD, which is thinking about expanding. And then the next one is the 1923 station, and it's located where the old railroad station was. So they towed the old railroad station up the road, and it's installed, and that's where the Black Dog Saloon will be. And the co-op will come over too, and Packer is there, and so little pieces of the north end of business are starting to activate in an interesting manner. It would be so nice to be able to bring a historic train in and park in that location. And also a little fun. Life should be fun, and these things are fun, and include finding out about your railroads and what they mean. You know, if you sit on a railroad, you may be connected to San Francisco. If you scratch around, you might find different rock that's being used as a ballast. Where did the trees come from to make the ties? What was the date of this stick rail, which is going to be replaced with rolled rail? Do you have steel ties? Because you don't have any trees left, and steel ties might have some advantages. Concrete ties might have advantages. So yes, think about your railroad when you walk along. Don't get dangerous. There's one guy in Danville just recently walked across in front of a train and got his shoes stuck in the ties, and that was the end of him. You have to treat the railroad. You have to imagine the driver of that train, and the rest of his life he has to think about as somebody who got killed. So when you're working with railroads and roads, be careful. I was wearing yesterday on South 45 a yellow jacket provided by the Department of Transportation, and that lets people know that you're there legitimately and you can be seen. Okay, I wanted to say something about Jane Addams. I've been reading her book. I just happened to walk into the Jane Addams store on Neal Street and saw this paperback sitting there, and I thought it was time I knew a little bit more about Jane Addams. I've really known her for a long time. There's a Hull House in Chicago. It's on University of Illinois territory, sort of hemmed in by huge buildings, so it doesn't look like Hull House that was on one of those streets in Chicago before the University of Illinois took over. Jane Addams was born in Rockford. Her father was a miller, and her father was very influential on her. So she dedicates the book to her father. Her mother was not quite as involved as father was, but Jane was born with something like scoliosis, so she had her head was held a little bit to one side, and she didn't feel that she was all that attractive, but she wanted to do things. So she went to a boarding school, which was a kind of a Victorian boarding school. She was born in 1860, so she came into life when there were Negroes that had been given freedom, but they weren't accepted or respected very much. There were immigrations coming in from Europe of grossly different ethnics, Italians, Polish, or Greek, and mixed up with that was black people from the South. So this was an awkward time, and by the time she got a bachelor's degree at Rockford College, she was aware of these happenings. Even their own towns had some semblance of the haves and have-nots. There was even a Darwinian feeling that the survival of the upper class it was part of a Darwinian selection. If you were rough and tough and able to survive, that was survival of the fittest, and that was part of the principle of Darwinian ecology. So the haves tended to control the situation, and there was sometimes in there a little corruption, and some of that was controlled by the people who were given work were to have to support a principle that they might not believe in, and that continues to some extent. You can find somebody with a very liberal disposition employed by a fairly conservative situation, and that's a conflict. So you may have them supporting both sides. So Jane moved to Europe. Didn't move to Europe. She toyed with doing medicine, but then left that and traveled to Europe. She didn't go to the European sites. She went to places like London, which have a very big population. My mother came from Cockney territory in London, so I'm somewhat aware that there are have-nots there. But there was a Toynbee Hall, and there were settlements that were doing interesting things. And so the places she and her associate, Miss Starr, visited these places and did the same in Germany, did the same in Russia. In Russia, they visited Toynbee. Not Toynbee, Toys. Let me have a glance. Toynbee Hall was one of the settlements that she really liked. Tolstoy. Tolstoy kind of believed and wrote. He believed that you should live what you're writing about. It isn't always necessary, but she visited Russia and visited him, and she oriented to sociology and started to look at some of the problems that exist. There weren't very many welfare laws. There's no welfare state. There was people worked 14 hours a day, and women and children worked without much pay, and there were slums and crowded, unsafe tenements, and starvation and disease and frustration, and well, health was not good. Sometimes you had a person that might be not wanting to move out of the immigrant territory, but so her graduating and degreed students would come back to that situation to live with her for a while or visit, and eventually they'd get tuberculosis because the air was so full of disease and so close. And so one woman like that lost a daughter for that same reason. She wanted to stay with the community she was in. And Jane Addams worked with a financier, and they gathered up a whole house, and in the middle of this territory, it was on Halstead, and Halstead was the middle of immigrants, and the immigrants couldn't talk to each other very well, and so they started to put together some of the thoughts that would go with this. And indeed, this was sort of a beginning settlement house movement that has continued through the country. The University of Chicago started up at about the same time, and it had an element that was sociologically oriented. So they looked at improved housing and education, and they also looked at poverty. They tried to document some of this, because if you don't document it, you don't know what you're looking at. And sometimes you can't document it if people are at home and you can't get access to them. So you need to sociologically work with the community to get to know each other and to get to know the people who know the people. And I find this has connotations for what we do here and now. This is good. And one of the things I did was to set up a house that would invite people to stay there, to invite people to go to the gymnasium, to express themselves. And sometimes if you get a person that is really a good carver of wood or an interesting person, when they come here and they do not have a job that excuse me, would entail these skills, then Hull House would start to say, what did you do when you were in Italy? How did you do it? Could you show us how to do it? Would you encourage a few friends? And this would make use of somebody's talents that would not exist if they were 14 hours a day doing things. They'll get young people together and have dances and give them opportunity to interact with each other. And the young people had a tremendous difficulty because they'd grown up in the U.S. and they had a U.S. attitude to life, and their parents didn't have a language that they could speak with. They were totally dependent on their children, and they didn't approve of some of the things that the children were doing. So the Hull House got to be a responsible place where you could get young folk together. No drinking drugs or anything like that, but one of the things they found out is as soon as these children got to an age where they could work, off they went to support the rest of the family, because many times the husband or the wife could not work and the child could, so the houses were dependent on the children. So those children didn't get to really have a life after that. So if they'd learned to play the violin or do interesting things, all of a sudden that died. If you were a poet, you didn't get to be a poet anymore. And that was so disappointing for Jane. So drama, they started to do drama. And drama, it doesn't necessarily need to have a language with it. And gradually people would get together and into teams. And then they would start to look at interesting things. If the alderman didn't fix the potholes in your road, then perhaps you could do it too. So often roads were made of wood, where blocks of wood were turned on the upside end. So people would steal the blocks for firewood. And that would create potholes. I can remember them in Sydney. If you created a railroad for trams, you had these blocks right up against the rail line, and they were a little loose and they could all rattle. Well, if the alderman wasn't prepared to fix that up, then you might just fix it up yourselves. But then the matter is how to challenge the alderman from being elected, because everyone in the area would have a job that was related to aldermen. So it would take perhaps 3 aldermanic sessions, like 4 years and 4 years and 4 years, to eventually find a way around that alderman, and that was encouraged by the Hull House. And that got them into strife, because if you had people who were doing that sort of thing, they could be beat up if necessary by the people who wanted to maintain control. And that drugstore up the road that was selling drugs, couldn't imagine why he was being closed out by the Hull House that didn't want the drugs, and he was making money, and money was the essence of the day. So gradually then you start to have civic organizations. You find 1, 2, 3, 4 people. People from the University of Chicago would come over and get to be on boards, and they would get on local boards, Hull House boards, and then on county boards and city boards, and have some power. Then the civic people, although you have some corruption sometimes, you also had people that were tremendously helpful. If you have a problem, then you go to your city and they would help to work out. So if you sit in your Hull House and don't do anything, then you don't have contact with those people. So out you go and you start to sit on boards that look at state regulations. So if 4-year-old kids are working in something and it's dangerous, then you might have a regulation as to what the first starting age is. It might be 13 or 14 or something like that. You start to find out how the current situation with policemen works. Who is doing who to control what. And so you have a state-level organization. And then, bless me, you go up to a national-level organization. And Jane Addams would sit on many of these boards. Sometimes she would be pushed off the board because she didn't have the right philosophy. But that's okay. If she wasn't being challenged, she wasn't doing her job. So one of the things that impressed me was the input of art and social interaction, food. At one stage, everyone used to go to a baker they'd prepare their bread and bake. But perhaps you could bake your bread in your own stove, if you had a stove. What was the quality of your building? A lot of the input from people who came from the South, the buildings were built with riprap and wood that was pushed together and not awfully safe. So how could that be managed? So I have a lot of respect for Jane Addams, and she did encourage a movement where there are settlement houses in other poverty situations, and those groups would come up with their ideas. So in this whole process, getting people together was very helpful. And if you come back right to WEFT, you get the same sort of thing. The interesting people come in and do interesting things, and then you can ask for some finance. But the basic thing is an idea. And one of my concerns here is related to the natural history situation and also the cultural history. It's a visual world right now. Everyone has their cell phone. They're looking at pictures often. So often a picture with a long shot, a medium shot, and a close-up is saying more than I can say on the radio. So that's why we have a camera, and it goes up on public television, and then it goes to YouTube. And it's available at any time. So going back to Jane, we look for cooperation, community cooperation, and how to get people together. I would like to go back to my Australian roots and how some of this sort of thing happened locally. Australia is very spread out, but it is also very urban. So 5 major cities: Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, and a little bit in Darwin, but mainly the total population of Australia is urban. The distances between are very spread out and not very fertile. Don't have the rich soils of east central Illinois. So you could be in the boondocks, and so you grow up with a one-teacher school. My father was a one-teacher school teacher. But guess what? He grew up in an area of Sydney that was a slum. So tenement villages, at a very small age, he had to go get wood for the stove. Most of these tenements had a copper, and the copper would be heated by wood that came from pallets and things that industry would have. So one of my father's jobs was to collect wood for stoves, and he there's a social concern there. So my father belonged to the Congregational Church, and the Congregational Church, along with Unitarians and a few others, are kind of on the liberal side, and they kind of on the sociological side. At one stage, the churches were very powerful because there weren't good schools, and the churches were the place where people got together. People came to do gymnastic work. People came to speak and politic, and you see that locally here, the North End community is still very dependent on the politics of the churches. And so my father went to go to high school, but his mother couldn't afford that, and his father couldn't afford that. So he had all his books ready to go, but he was pulled out of high school. So he worked his way through to the point where he could go to the university, and he became a congregational minister. And like here, I ran into a similar situation here where somebody didn't have a high school diploma, but he'd gone through university. But when they went to graduate him, they found out that he was missing a key thing. He was working with space programs and a very intelligent person. So my father was a little in the same situation. He had a church for about 5 years, congregational church, and from that did work a lot of things. He'd been a jack of all trades, so he was a carpenter, a glass works person. At one stage, I think he was selling corsets or something like that. He was all over the place, but then had a formal church. But his interest, he wasn't as godly, he felt, as his clients. His congregation was more godly than he, so he decided to leave the church and go school teaching. So I've been fairly close to some of this sort of thing where you're starting to think about how you organize and how you do. So when I first came here, I was very reluctant to I have a term for it. It's like teaching your grandmother how to suck duck eggs. That means that in Europe, especially, if you want to sketch, draw interesting patterns on eggs, you put a little hole in the bottom of the egg, and you either suck it out or you blow it out. Mostly you suck it out, but it's a technique. And if you're a young person and you want to improve the process and speed it up, you don't tell your grandmother how to suck duck eggs. Well, I didn't do that. I was very reluctant to do things like start the Grand Prairie Friends or start the Natural Area Study Group or start Education Resources and Environmental Science. But somewhere there was a need for it. And at the same time, other people were feeling the same. In Galesburg, there was Peter Schramm and people that were at Doug Wade and others that started a North American Prairie Conference. And that was because there was no North American Prairie Conference, and we were losing prairie at a rapid rate. Very good at soil, very useful for other things, but it's really very nice that these people started out with about 30 people, and the North American Conference is run every 2 years, and now there's an archive in Iowa has a Northern University of Iowa. There's a lot of prairie in the school, and they have a graduate program, graduate program for people who want to do prairie. 2 minutes. Okay, well, we're West Jackson is in the West Jackson's daughters works at that place. So gradually, you look at a problem, and you see if you can find a way of creating a structure that you can work with. And that's sort of what we're trying to do here. We hope we'll preserve a little piece of railroad. If you're interested, call us up, because you might have ideas that are far better than we have, and we'd like to incorporate those ideas. We learn from people. We especially learn from young people who have active minds and have a different way of doing things. We have a little bit of wisdom because we've been around for a while, but that's not all of it. So I think that's all we can say. Thank you for listening. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And
Dave on the board. You should give them your phone number if they're going to call you. What number should they?
okay, 351-1911. Area code 217-351-1911 or 217-840-1911 or monkdavid0@gmail.com. monkdavid0@gmail.com. And thank you for being interested.
And if you wonder what he was talking about when he was talking about long shot, middle shot, close-ups, we've learned how to use some movie speak in getting together with UPTV and putting together the videos that go with the episodes that you're listening to on the radio right this very minute. So if you go to YouTube and you look for either the UPTV channel or just type in the words The Prairie Monk, believe it or not, the word the is important there. You can find videos. We've got years worth of videos that go along with Dave's program. And we've created quite a few maps to show you different things. And we always have a long shot and then a medium shot and then a close up of what we're talking about. So if you go online, you might actually get additional information to help this stuff make sense to you. It's a Mother's Day. Keep that in mind. And if you do decide to contact Mr. Monk, do remember that you can't teach him new things about sucking duck eggs. I think we've made that very clear here. It's noon and it's time now for Shruti Music of India here on WEFT Champaign 90.1 FM.